All right, Rabosai, good morning. Let us begin. I want to begin by thank you, Sammy. Thank you. I want to begin by thanking our sponsors, our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Sivan, to thank Naftoli and Chava Tilson for dedicating all of the shiurim and drashos this month. Naftali dedicating in honor of his chaver Benjamin Wohl, for introducing him to the Daf Yomi. May Hashem bless us all to finish the Daf Yomi cycle together. Celebrate with the siyum in Eretz Yisrael. Amen. To thank Baruch Meir and Rena Dubin for dedicating all the shiur and drashos this month. And the schus may Hashem continue to protect our brothers and sisters in Eretz Yisrael. And may all of our children remain safe and complete their year of learning with a deep connection to the land and to Hashem's Torah. And to thank our week of learning sponsor, Mrs. Salma Wolf, in the schus of a refuah shlema for her grandson, Kobe Rofberg, Yaakov Zev Ben Sivya Devora. We hope that he, together with Kol Cholei Yisrael, will have a complete and enduring refuah. And also with that, let us begin. So we have a lot to do today, Baruch Hashem. Today's daf is Nun Dalid 54, but we are actually picking up on Nun Gimel Amud Beis. We left off pretty much like in the middle of the daf here, Tanu Rabbanan. So if you see where the Mishnah is, it's about 2, 4, 6 lines up from the Mishnah. So Tan Rabbanan. So we'll say, remember again, the Divrei Hamaschil over here was talking about that Tefillah Kitzara, that when the Kohen Gadol would emerge from the Kodesh HaKadoshim, the Mishnah said that he would utter a short prayer. And again, we saw, it's incredible, we saw in yesterday's daf, the nature of that short prayer, that pretty much most of it was related to the Gashmius of Klal Yisrael, right? If it's going to be a hot year, it should be a rainy year. Klal Yisrael shouldn't require each other, but ultimately he leaves off with saying, do not listen to the tefillah of the Ovrei Jerachim, which was incredibly profound. Do not go ahead and listen to the tefillah of the travelers, because the travelers would daven that HaKadosh Baruch Hu would withhold the rain, but Klal Yisrael needed the rain. We saw the beautiful story of Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa, and with that the Gemara picks up. So Tanu Rabbanan. So the Gemara says as follows. So Tanu Rabbanan, Maisa b'Kohen Gadol, Maisa b'Kohen Gadol echad sheherich b'tfilasa. So the Gemara says as follows. There was one time one of the Kohanim Gedolim who prolonged his tefillah. So in other words, remember again, the Mishnah is quite explicit in saying that it's a tefillah kitzara. It's supposed to be a short prayer. So one time, one of the Kohanim Gedolim took their time. V'nimnu echav hakohanim nikanes acharav. And the other Kohanim said, you know what? We're going to go ahead and go in and find out what's going on. Remember again, I will say, as I mentioned in yesterday's daf, when the Kohen Gadol is doing his avoda inside the Kodesh HaKadoshim, no one else is inside of the Mikdash. So no one really knows what's happening. So they go ahead and they realize that they obviously knew the amount of time, normal time that it would take for the Kohen Gadol to do the avodah of the Ketores. So some amount of time elapses. They get nervous. So it's interesting, I will say, the Maharsha comments on this. They were scared. Maybe he's at Tzduki. We knew this guy all this time. Maybe he was at Tzduki. And what happened if he was at Tzduki? What happened? It means he was probably dead, right? Because remember again, we saw that Tzdukim would go ahead and kindle the Ketores outside of the Kodesh. So maybe they were afraid that something had happened to him. So what happens? So we'll say, this is incredible. As they're going in to get him, he's coming out. So they said to him, what are you doing, right? Why did you prolong your tefillah? Right? It's supposed to be a tefillah kitzara. So why did you prolong your tefillah? Amar lahem, kasha be'inechem shispalalti alechem va'beis hamikdash shelo yicharev. So say this is so profound. So the Kohen Gadol gets angry. Are you upset at me that I was davening for all of you and about the Beis Hamikdash that it should not be destroyed? So obviously, again, we're talking about over here, presumably Second Temple era, where unfortunately, again, things were beginning to downward spiral. So the Kohanim come in, they're all upset at the Kohen Gadol. Where have you been? The Kohen Gadol said, really, you bragis at me? I've been davening for you. I've been davening for Klal Yisrael. I've been davening for the Beis Hamikdash. And you're upset at me. So look what they say. Amrulo, al tihi ragil lasos came. Don't do it again. Don't do do this. Why? Shaishaninu lo haya marich b'tfilasa kidesh lo haves hasisra. Because after all, again, we learned in the Mishnah that Allah Chalamaisi, you're not supposed to go ahead and prolong the tefillah lest you go ahead and cause Klal Yisrael to fear, right? So remember again, so they say back to the Kohen Gadol, we appreciate your tefillah, but at the end of the day, this is not something you're supposed to do. And I will say, as we saw 2 days ago when we mentioned this concept, there is a profound lesson in this, which is that one must make sure that their bein adam lemakom does not come at the expense of their bein adam lechavero. That I have an obligation to forge a meaningful relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but I have to make sure that that meaningful relationship does not come at the expense of my interpersonal behavior. You know, sometimes, unfortunately, people think that in the pursuit of a meaningful relationship with God, I have license to trample upon others. But it does not work that way, right? At the end of the day, even in the pursuit of the most meaningful, even if you're the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur, you still have to keep in mind that there are other people who are worrying about you, right? So you would think, Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur is into the Kodesh HaKadoshim, you know, Kohen Gadol, you come out whenever you're ready. You're going to daven to your heart's content. No, people are standing out there worrying. You have to be mindful of that. An incredible yisod. Be mindful of the feelings of others, even in the pursuit of your relationship with Hashem. Beautiful. Mishnah. Mishanita Aron. So we'll say when the Aron was gone. Remember again, so as we saw in yesterday's daf already, during the second Beis HaMikdash, there was already remember again, during the end of this first Beis HaMikdash, the Aron was hidden away. Remember again, we saw in yesterday's daf, who hid it away? King Yoshio. Good. King Yoshio hides it away. Again, we'll see an interesting machlokes is about to occur. But here's what we know. Certainly all of Second Temple era, there was no Aron. There was no ark. So the Gemara says, Mishanetel Aron, Even Haisa Sham Mimos Nevim Harishonim, Ushesia Haisa Nikres. So I'll say this is very interesting. The Mishnah tells us that the Aron did not sit on the ground. Instead, the Aron actually sat on a, what we'll call, for lack of a better term, like a stone. But it's not just a stone. It's probably better stated as like a stone platform. And that stone platform was called the Even Shesia. That was the name, the Even Shesia. So again, it was the dome of the rock, right? The dome of the rock. The rock that's referred to over there is the rock upon which the Aron used to sit. So that's the Even Shesia. So the Gemara says, Haisa nikres gavoa mina aretz shalosh etzbos. It was 3 finger breadths off the ground. Va'aleha haya nosin. And the Aron was situated upon that stone. So we'll say, so again, even though there's no Aron in the second Beis HaMikdash, the Even Shesia, that stone was present. So the Gemara says, and we're going to see Va'aleh Hayanosin also means not only was the Aron placed there, but all the sprinkling of blood that would have normally been done, by the Aron or on the Aron was simply done in that same makom by the Even Shesia. Not less hadam. So we'll say now, jumping back to the avoda, the Kohen Gadol would take the dam of the par. He would take the blood of the par, mimisha hayim emaris, from the person who was stirring it. Because remember again, let's say we will shortly go through. I mentioned to you that the Rambam in Hilchos Yom Kippur and Parak Dalet Halacha Aleph goes through the entire sequence of the avoda. So we'll put this all together in the Rambam. But if you remember again, the Kohen Gadol shechted the par, and then the par service was kind of put on hold a little bit till after the Ketoras. Now the Ketoras was done. He would go back to get the blood of the par. Remember again what was happening with the blood of the par this entire time? It was being stirred, right? Where was it being stirred? 4th step outside of the Beis HaMikdash. That's where the memar is. That's where the stir is going ahead and standing. So now the Kohen Gadol goes back, gets the blood of the par. Nichnas lamakom shenichnas va'amad b'makom sha'amad. He would go back to the place where he stood, or he would go back to the place where he had entered and stand in the place where he stood. So we'll say, so again, what is that a reference to? You see, it's interesting. We have to remember, and we do remember this because we see this in the Seder HaAvoda every year in Musaf of Yom Kippur, but essentially the Kohen Gadol, we often think Kohen Gadol would only go into the Kodesh HaKadoshim once on Yom Kippur for the Ketorah service. It's not true. We're going to see it goes in and out a couple of times. So when it says Nichnas lamakom shenichnas, he goes back into the place where he was standing. That means he goes now with the blood of the par, and he goes into the Kodesh HaKadoshim, and he stands where he stood. That's a reference once again to the Kodesh HaKadosh, because also remember again, where does the Kohen Gadol stand in the Kodesh HaKadoshim? Where does he stand? Remember again, he stands, because remember, he entered on the left, right, the curtain, first outer curtain. He entered to the left, which was the southern side of the curtain, walks towards the north, walks in on the north side of the curtain, then hangs a left, right? Walking back down south, so the curtain is on his left, and then what does he do? He turns with his back towards the curtain. So the Kohen Gadol is essentially facing east, or facing west, I should say, right? He's facing west, back to the curtain. So that's what it means. He goes back and stands in the place where he was standing. V'hiza mimenu, and he sprinkles the blood. Achos lamala v'sheva lamata. 1 time above and 7 times below. So I'll say, so when there was an aron, the 1 time above means towards the area of the kapores, of the lid of the aron. That's the above, and the below is below the kapores, below the lid of the aron. Now we're going to see he does not sprinkle blood on. It sounds like he sprinkles blood on the aron. It's not sprinkling blood on the aron, but rather again, it's more of a directional statement. He sprinkles the blood 1 time above in the direction and at the height of the lid of the aron, and ultimately again then 7 times below the lid of the aron. And I will say he didn't literally go ahead and apply the blood above and below, but rather he applied the blood kimatzlif. We saw this expression before. Matzlif means literally like a whip. Like he would go ahead and just, we'll see in the Gemara what it means. The kachayamona, and I will say this is incredible. And this is how you would count. Achos, right? Achos was for the first one on top of the kapores. Achas v'yachas, achas v'shtayim, achas v'shalosh, achas v'arba, achas v'chomesh, achas v'sheish, achas v'sheva. Well, it's so beautiful. So remember again, now you can appreciate the counting. The achos is the first blood application, the first sprinkling, which was done above. Remember again, above means at the height of the kapores, at the height of the lid of the aron, so that he would keep count. He would do achos. Okay, that's one. Then achas v'achas. Achas v'achas was the second one, right? Was the second one out of the sequence, but the first one below the lid. So that again, achas. Achas ushtayim. So the achas was the one at the height of the kapores, and then again, shtayim below. So that's how we just keep count. This way he would know exactly where he was up to. Incredible. Yatsa v'henicho al kanazah. So we'll say now, the Kohen Gadol would leave the Kodesh HaKadoshim. Now remember, there was still par blood. So what would he do with the par blood? There was a kanazav, there was a gold stand inside of the mikdash. This is right outside of the kapore, right outside of the paroches. So again, kapores is the lid of the aron. Paroches is the curtain, right? So he would come out of the Kodesh HaKadoshim, and right outside of the Kodesh HaKadoshim was a golden stand. He would place the cup or the receptacle with the par blood in that golden stand. Then they would bring him the sair, the goat. Shachto, he would shech the goat. The kibel b'mizrak as damo, and he would go ahead and receive the blood in a bowl. Mizrak is a bowl. Nichnas lamakom shenichnas, va'ama b'makom sha'amad. And I will say once again, what does he do with the blood of the sair? He goes back into the Kodesh HaKadoshim. So also we're going to see the Kohen Gadol actually goes into the Kodesh HaKadoshim on Yom Kippur a total of 3 times. Once for the Ketores, once for the dam of the par, and now a 3rd time for the dam of the sair. And with the dam of the sair, he repeats the same exact process. V'hiza mimenu achas lamala v'sheva lamata, v'kachayamona achas v'achas achas ushtayim. So we'll say same exact process with the dam of the sair as he performed with the dam of the par. Yotza v'henichu al kanazav. He comes out with the remainder of the blood, and he places it on the golden stand. Al kanazav hashini shevehechol. Rabbi Yehuda Omer lo hayasham el kanechas. So the Tanakama holds there were two golden stands, right? One to hold the remaining dam of the par, and one to hold the remaining dam of the sayer. Rabbi Huda disagrees. He says no. There was only one stand, and therefore natal dam hapar ve'niach dam hasayer v'hiza mimenu ala parochas shekineget ha'ar mibachutz. So listen to this, because the truth is, Rabbi Huda holds you never had a need for two stands because you were always using one of the bloods. You were always using one of the bloods. So the Gemara says, so for example, when the Kohen Gadol would emerge back out of the Kodesh Kodeshim from the third time, so now he finished sprinkling the blood of the par, what would he do? He would then go ahead and take he would finish sprinkling the dam of the sayer. He would then go back, take the dam of the par, and what would he do with it? Another act of sprinkling. Where would this sprinkling be done? I will say this sprinkling was done opposite the paroches, opposite the curtain. So now again, remember, this is outside of the Kodesh HaKadoshim. He's taking the remaining dam of the par, sprinkling it opposite the paroches. Shekineged the arn mibachutz. And again, once again, achos lamala v'sheva lamata. Once again, I will say all sprinklings are done with this sequence. Once above, 7 below. So we'll say, so again, that's how he would go ahead and then use the dama par again. Then he would go back and take the dama sayer. Natal dama sayer v'hiniach dama par. Then he would go ahead and take the dam of the sayer, put down the dam of the par. V'hiza mimenu ala parochas shekineged armi b'chutz. Achos lamala b'shava lamata. Once again, there'd be a sprinkling. Once above, 7 below. And they both said this was the process. So just to kind of consolidate this, the Kohen Gadol would go ahead and do the ketores, come out from the ketores, take the dam of the par, go into the Kodesh HaKadoshim, go ahead and do the sprinkling, right? A total of eight times. Once above, 7 below, come out of the Kodesh HaKadoshim, put the remaining par blood in the stand, shecht the sayer, get the blood of the sayer, take the blood inside of the Kodesh HaKadoshim, same thing, 8 sprinklings in total, once above, 7 below, come back out. Now we have a machlokes, where there are 2 stands or 1 stand. Okay, we'll discuss where that machlokes comes from. In any event, after he comes out of the Kodesh HaKadoshim with the dam of the sayer, he then picks up the dam of the par again, does another set of sprinklings, this time outside of the Kodesh HaKadoshim, on the paroches, or again, corresponding to the curtain, right opposite the aron. He does that with the dam of the par, puts down the dam of the par, does that same thing with the dam of the sayer. At this point in time, the sprinklings are over. What does the Kohen Gadol do with the remaining blood? Because there was always remaining blood. Ira dam ha-par l'soch dam ha-sayer v'nasan es hamali v'reikin. At this point in time, the Kohen Gadol goes ahead and combines the 2 bloods, right? He pours literally again the dam ha-par into the dam of the sayer, and then puts the receptacles one into the other. This is why Rabbi Huda says you never really needed more than 1 stand, because halacha lamaisa, you were always what? Using one of the bloods, right? You were always doing that, and then at the end of the process, anyway, you poured them together and put one kli into the other, so you really only needed 1 stand. Incredible. Both sides. I'm going to show you something now in the Gemara that I know a number of you have remarked the excitement about seeing the Gemara from yesterday's daf about walking backwards, right, with different things. So there's a lot of things that we see in the daf that are just things that we know, but it's incredible to see where they come from. So you're supposed to look at this Gemara. You might not know this, but this is an incredible machlokes. Look what the Gemara says. Mishenignas lo katani ela mishenital. But the Gemara makes a startling observation. The Mishnah does not say when the aron was hidden away. Instead, what does it say? When the aron was taken. When the aron was taken. Why does it say when it was taken? It should say when it was hidden away. To which the Gemara says, Satani kiman damra aron gala lebavel. Wow. Because Rabbi said there's a machlokes. Not everyone agrees with what we learned yesterday, that the aron was hidden away by King Yoshio. But in fact, some say that the aron was actually taken with the destruction of the first Beis HaMikdash. That the reason why there was no ark in the second Beis HaMikdash was not because it was hidden away, but because it was taken by Bavel when they destroyed the first Beis HaMikdash. So the Gemara says, the sign Rabbi Eliezer Omer Aron Gala leBavel. Rabbi Eliezer says that the Aron was exiled to Bavel. Shnei Maru l'tshuvas Hashana Shalach HaMelech Nebuchadnezzar Vayivi'ehu Bavela im klei chemdas beis Hashem. So the Navi makes reference over here to the fact that Nebuchadnezzar took the klei chemdas, the beautiful kalim of the Beis Hashem. And ultimately, Rabbi Eliezer understands that to mean the Aron. Rabbi Shimon Yochai Omer, Aron Gala Bavel. Rashbi also says the Aron was taken to Bavel. Shnei Amar, Lo Yivasir Davar Amar Hashem, Elu Aser Sadibro Shabo. Nothing will be left over. HaKadosh Baruch Hu says that refers even to the 10 Commandments. In other words, the luchos that were housed in the Aron. Rabbi Yehuda ben Lakish Omer, Aron Bimkomo Nignas. Reish Lakish says no, the Aron was not exiled, rather the Aron was hidden away. Shnei Amar, Vayiru Rashi Abadim min HaKodesh al Pnei HaDevir, V'lo Yira Achutza V'yusham ad Hayom Hazeh. So we'll say Reish Lakish says that the pasuk says they saw the poles themselves that extended into the curtain. We'll discuss this more, but the poles of the Aron actually protruded into the curtain, such when you were standing on the other side of the paroches of the Kodesh HaKadoshim, you saw the poles extending into the curtain ad hayom hazeh, and it is there in the mikdash until this day. Reish Lakish understands that ad hayom hazeh literally means that the Aron is in the mikdash compound until this day, not in the Kodesh HaKadoshim, but until this day. We'll say a dramatic machlokes. What happened to the Aron? Was the Aron hidden away by King Yoshio, like we learned in yesterday's daf, or was the Aron actually taken by Bavel when they went ahead and destroyed the Beis Hamikdash? Absolutely overwhelming and incredible. Pliga de Ula. And if this argues on Ula, what did Ula say? Damar Ula, Shal Rabbi Masya ben Charash, Rabbi Shimon Yochai Beromi. But listen to this. Rabbi Masya ben Charash asked Rashbi in Rome. I want to point out, Rabbi Masya ben Charash was in Pirkei Avos says have a makdim as okay, I forgot Lashon the Mishnah. Rabbi Masya ben Charash holds that you're supposed to greet every person with a smiling countenance. Okay, and Masya ben Charash started the first yeshiva in Rome. So that's why, again, when it says in Rome, Masya ben Charash started the first yeshiva in Rome. So the Gemara says as follows: So the Gemara says, so that which we learned, that according to Rashbi, the Aron was taken ultimately again to Bavel. So I understand the first pasuk. The first pasuk is the one we quoted. Shnia Mahi. What's the second pasuk that makes reference to this? Tichsiv vayetze mibas Tzion, top of Nun Daled, kol hadara. The pasuk in Eicha says that Bas Tzion lost all of her beauty. My kol hadara, chadara. We'll say, so instead of reading it hadara, her beauty, chadara, she lost that which was kept in the room. What's the reference to that which was kept in the room? A reference to the Aron, which was kept in the Kodesh HaKadoshim. So the Gemara says, Ata Mayata Omer. So what do you say to this? Amrlo, Shani Omer, Aron Rim Komo Nignas. I hold that the Aron, in fact, was hidden away in its very place. In the Mikdash, Shneimar, Vayarichu Habadim. So both say, because the Pasuk says, Vayarichu Habadim. Now both say, what they're focusing on that Pasuk, when the pasuk says that the poles of the Aron extended into the curtain, it says, and they extended into the curtain, and they're there ad hayom hazeh, until this day. Now, obviously, no one's interpreting it to mean ad hayom hazeh to actually mean that the Aron is situated in the Kodesh HaKadoshim ad hayom hazeh, but rather what they're trying to understand is ad hayom hazeh means the Aron is in the Mikdash. It's somewhere in the Mikdash compound, ad hayom hazeh. Amalei Rav, Amalei Rabbi Ula, my mashma. So you're picking up on the fact that the phrase is ad hayom hazeh until this very day. But come on, do you really believe that when the pasuk says until this very day, that it literally means until present, like right now? In other words, we view it more as an expression, something everlasting, something happening for a long time, but lav dafka, that it's actually literal until today. So the Gemara says, Vaksiv, I'll give you examples of this. That ad hayom hazeh does not literally mean until today. Dichsiv, Vaksiv, Ves hayevusi Yoshev Yerushalayim, Lohorishu b'nei Binyamin, Vayeshev hayevusi es b'nei Binyamin b'Yerushalayim ad hayom hazeh. So the Gemara says, for example, that the Shevet of Binyamin was unsuccessful under Yoshua in driving the Yevusi out of Yerushalayim, and the Yevusi lived in Yerushalayim ad hayom hazeh. Is that true? Adi Yevusi Yerushalayim Ad Hayom Hazeh. After all, so the Gemara says, Hachanami Delo Galu. Do you think that means that the Yevusi are still there? Tanya Rabbi Yehuda Omer Chamishim U'Shtayim Shana Lo Avar Ish BeYehuda. There were 52 years, Rabosai, where the area, the tribal area of Yehuda, was desolate. No one was there. No one lived there. Shneimar Ala Harem Esa Bechi V'nei Ve'Alna Osmin Barkina Ki Nisu Mibli Ish Over V'lo Shamu Kol Miknem Of Hashemayim V'Ad Behema Nadru Halachu. So the Gemara asks, where do you get? So it says it was desolate. Even behemoths, even animals did not traverse the area. And behema b'gematria chamish mushtayim havu. Behema, the numerical value of behema, is 52. So again, what's the point? The point over here is the pasuk makes it sound like that the Yevusi are in Yerushalayim ad hayom hazeh, until today. But again, we know that that's not true. There was a period of time where no one was there. Certainly the Yevusi is not there either. Furthermore, we're going to both say, ultimately, you're going to remember, well, good. But Tanya, Rabbi Yossi says, we'll say second wide line, nun dalad amud aleph. V'sanya Rabbi Yossi omer sheva shanim niskaima gafres u'malach b'Eretz Yisrael. Both say, in the aftermath of the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash and the Babylonian exile, there are periods of time where Eretz Yisrael was mamish desolate. So Rabbi Yossi says, Sheva shanim niskaima gafres v'melach b'Eretz Yisrael. There was a 7 years. There was gafres v'melach. And gafres v'melach literally means sulfur and salt, which just represents utter desolation in Eretz Yisrael. I'm Rabbi Yochanan. My time with Rabbi Yossi. Where does Rabbi Yossi get this from? Asya bris. He makes an example. Sheva bris. Ksiv hacha v'hegber bris. I'm sorry. Quotes over here the pasuk from Daniel. V'hegber bris l'rabim shavua echad. V'ksiv hasam va'amru ala asher azvu es bris Hashem Elokei avosam. All right. Amar lehacha ksiv sham hasam lo ksiv sham. So it says, here's the difference. Ultimately, in the first pasuk it says sham. There it doesn't say sham. 1 second. V'chol heichad v'ksiv sham de'olamu. So also what the Gemara is suggesting is like this. No. When it says ada yom hazeh, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's for eternity. But when it says sham, that whatever the item in question was there, sham, ada yom hazeh, that means the item or the people in question are there until present day. So the Gemara says, is that true? Meisvei, I'm sorry, b'chol heichad d'chsiv sham. The Olam, is that true? So whenever it says ada yom hazeh and sham, that means that the people or the entity is there mamish until this very day. So Meisar is a kasha. Umehem min b'nei Shimon holchu lahar seir. Anoshim chamesh meos uplateu na'ara urafa'ah v'uziel b'nei Yishi b'rosham vayaku asheris hapleita la'amalek vayeshvu sham ad hayom hazeh. Supposed to be the Gemara quotes the pasuk from Divrei Hayomim, speaking about again that members of the tribe of Shimon, of Bnei Shimon, went to Har Seir, dispossessed the people or conquered the people who were living there and occupied the area, and they stayed there ad hayom hazeh. So the Gemara says, so it says they were sham, they were there ad hayom hazeh. So the Gemara says, really? So do we take that to mean that they're there until today? Ayu kvar alu sancheriv melech asher ubilba kol ha'aratzos. But remember again, we know that Sancheriv, the king of Ashur, came along and what? Mixed up all of the nations already. So that people were not situated in the areas in which they previously lived. Shneimar quotes over here the pasuk from, again, Divrei Hayomim. From Yeshayahu. Va'asir gevulos amim. Va'atudosehem sosesi. Va'orid ka'abir yoshrim. So the Gemara says to Yufta, Inachinami, you are correct. So we'll say, they refute this idea. So therefore, again, what turns out is, interestingly enough, that halacha lemaisa, the raya that the aron is in its place, based on ad hayom hazeh, that seems to be refuted. Now it happens to be the Rambam paskins, like the first version, not like Rashbi, but like what we saw yesterday. The Rambam paskins that the aron was actually hidden in place. Right, with there was a subterranean chamber that was constructed by Shlomo HaMelech, and King Yoshio hides the Aron when he begins to see that the destruction, of Yerushalayim was imminent. But interestingly enough, that seems to be based much more on Masorah and on the pasuk that we actually quoted in yesterday's daf, and not really based on this idea of ad hayom hazeh. Because what the Gemara has successfully proven is that even when it says ad hayom hazeh, even if it uses the word sham, that's much more of what? Of an expression than it is an actual statement of fact. Incredible. So Amar Rav Nachman Tana, the Chachamim Omrim, Aron belishkas dir eitzim hayagana. So let's listen to this. The Chachamim hold that, again, with the approach that the Aron was hidden inside of the Beis Hamikdash compound. But I will say what the Chachamim add in over here is we know exactly where the Aron was hidden. That's my Beis Hamikdash picture. Okay, we know exactly where the Aron was. Where the Aron was hidden. And where was the Aron hidden? The Aron was hidden in a place called the Lishkas Dir Ha'etzim, which I will say is this Lishka, is this chamber right over here. Right? This is where wood was kept for the Beis Hamikdash. So remember again what happened in this Lishka. So as we're going to see, Kohanim who were Ba'ali Mumin, right? Kohanim who were blemished and therefore unable to go ahead and work in the Beis Hamikdash would work over here to go ahead and deworm wood. That was their job. So the Gemara now suggests that the Beis Hamikdash itself was hidden in the Lishkas Dir Eitzim. So let's listen to this. Amrav Nachman Bar Yitzchak. Afana Nami Tanina. We learned this as well. So the Gemara says, Afana Nami Tanina. Ma'aseh v'kohen echad shay misasek. One time there was a Kohen who was misasek. Now I will say misasek means he was busying himself with really unnecessary stuff. Right? You know what the better word is? Preoccupied. Right? He was preoccupied. So what happened? So literally he's a shtickle bored, preoccupied. So what does he do? He goes ahead and he realizes that one of the floor tiles is different than the other ones. Isn't that interesting? He realizes one of the floor tiles is different than the other ones. So what happens? He goes and he grabs his friend, right? He gets his chaver, says, look, you want to see something strange? And he didn't even get to relay the information until what? Before he had passed away. So the Gemara said, "V'yadu biyichud shesham aron ganos." So what's interesting about this story is they had a Masorah that the Aron was hidden somewhere in the Mikdash, but they did not know where. This Kohen stumbles upon something, and it was Misasek. So we'll say, why does the Gemara have to bring down that he was preoccupied with something? Because we'll say what the Gemara is saying is like this. It's always important to remain on task and to remain focused on important things. Because if you allow yourself to get distracted, you often get involved in things that are unimportant and often counterproductive. It's an incredible yesod in life. See here, what was this Kohen? He wasn't doing anything bad, right? It's not like he was doing something on Avera Chas v'Shalom. He was just preoccupied. Don't get preoccupied in life. Don't get distracted in life. Because when you get distracted, you get caught up in all the wrong stuff. An incredible yesod. Stay on task. Stay on point. Remain directed in whatever it is that you have to accomplish. So the Gemara says, what happened? The Gemara tells another story. The other story. So the Gemara says, my hava avid. What was he doing? It just says, what was he distracted with? Just out of curiosity. So we're getting now distracted with the story, right? So now, but what was he doing? What was he doing that was just so distracting or so preoccupying? So the Gemara says, Amr Bichelbo, misasik pikardu mahaya. He was playing with his axe. Right? Whatever it is, So again, I will say, nothing illicit. So I just want to point out this incredible musar in this. Incredible musar. Don't get distracted in life. Because when you get distracted, you just get focused on all the wrong things. So we'll say another story. Similar, again, all pointing to the same idea that the Aron was hidden in the Dir Eitzim, just different stories highlighting how that came to be known. So the Gemara says one time there were two Kohanim Bali Mumin, two blemished Kohanim. Remember again, because that was their job, they would deworm wood. So the Gemara says, Hayu Maslim Be'eitzim, they were deworming wood in the Dir Eitzim. And Ishmita Kardumo Shel Echam, both says incredible. One of them dropped their axe, and what happened? The Nafla Sham, it fell on the floor. And apparently what ended up happening was it punctured the floor a little bit. In other words, it must have cracked the stone. So the Gemara says, V'yatza sa'esh, a fire came out of the ground, va'achlaso, and it consumed the axe. I will say that's how they saw that obviously, it pointed to the fact that the Aron was buried in the Lishkas Dir Eitzim. Rav Yehuda Ramiksiv, Vayiru Rashi Abadim, Oksiv Lo Yira Chutza. So we'll say now, jumping back for just a moment. So now, we pretty much established that the majority opinion is that the Aron was hidden in the Beis Hamikdash chamber. And not only that, but apparently we even know the location. It was underneath the Lishkas Dir Eitzim. Right? That's where it was. So the Gemara now tells another story. So the Gemara says, well, not a story, but contrast something. Rabbi Yehuda says, on one hand, the pasuk says, Vayir Rashi Abadim. The pasuk seems to indicate that the general populace were able to see the poles of the Aron. But yet, Uksiv V'lo Yira Achutza. But yet the pasuk then says that the poles, for that matter, the rest of the Aron as well, could not be seen on the outside. So Kate said, Nirin ve'ino Nirin. So we'll say, so you see that the poles were seen, but yet could not be seen. What does this mean? That supports this. So we'll say the pasuk says they saw the poles. You might have thought that the poles could not be moved from their place. Therefore, the pasuk says that ultimately, again, the badim were extended. So here's the interesting halacha with the badim, with the poles, is you were never permitted to remove them from the aron, but you were permitted to slide them within their rings. Remember, again, the badim were not fixed in place. They were slid through golden rings. So what the Gemara says over here is that when the aron was situated in the Kodesh HaKadoshim, it appears that they would slide the poles forward. You'll see why in just a moment. And you might have thought that maybe the poles pierce through the parochas, ultimately again, and come through. And therefore, the pasuk says they shall not be seen on the outside. So which one is it? So again, we see them contradictory psukim, because the psukim seem to indicate to us that you can see the poles, and then other psukim say you can't see the poles. So which one is it? So the Gemara says, dochkin uboltin v'yotzim beparoches v'nirin kishnei dade isha. So the Gemara says what happened is that the poles would press against and protrude from the curtain and produce the outline of the poles, just like the chest of the woman, right? That you could see the outline of the woman's breasts from the outside of her shirt. So too the Gemara says over here, you could see the outline of the poles from the parochas. Shene Amar Srar Hamar Dodili Bein Shaddai. And I will say it's quite beautiful actually, because shiur, which in general is a very enigmatic work, and it's sometimes hard to understand. So the Gemara says literally, Surah Hamar means a bundle of myrrh. Dodi li is my beloved. Bein Shaddai Yolin. Between the Shaddayim he rests. So we'll say, what's the allusion to the Shaddayim? So the Gemara says that the poles extended out of the parochas, ultimately again, like the Shaddayim. We'll say it's actually, the metaphor is actually incredible, because what it's talking about over here is something that you know is present, and that you could see in a certain way, but you can't see in its totality. So the ability to see the presence of the Aron was there, right? Everyone could see, because even a Yisrael could see into the Kodesh, so you could see the protrusions. So in other words, you could see with your own eyes that the Aron was there. But yet, again, the nature of the holiness of the Aron, the intimate part of what that kli represented in the relationship with Hashem and Am Yisrael, was hidden behind the curtain. So you could see its presence, you could see it pushing out against the curtain, but yet the rest of the Aron you could not actually see. Pretty incredible. So the Gemara says, Amrav Katina, listen to this. B'shasha Yisrael olin l'regel. Both say this is so beautiful. When Klal Yisrael would come for Aliyah l'regel, Pesach, Shavuos, Sukkos, megalilin lahenes haparoches. The Kohanim would roll back, they would pull back the curtains. Umarin lahem esakruvim shemuurin zebazeh. And they would show them the kruvim. We'll say, so now remember again, let's take a step back. The kruvim were the two cherub-like, angelic-like figures perched on top of the Aron. So I will say the kruvim are quite fascinating in general in terms of what they looked like, right? Children, adults. Now, the Gemara is going with the approach over here that the kruvim looked, one was male and one was female. So the Gemara says something amazing, that during the Aliyah L'Rega, what would happen is the Kohanim would pull back the curtains, right? You wouldn't take out the Aron, but they would pull back the curtains so that Klal Yisrael could see into the Kodesh HaKadoshim. And what would they see? What would they see? They would see the kruvim locked in an embrace. Isn't that incredible? They would see the kruvim embracing each other. Murim zeva zeva omrim lahem. See how much HaKadosh Baruch Hu loves you. kichibas zachar unekeva, like the love that a man loves a woman. Shabbos said this is incredible because the Rambam in Hilchos Deos writes about this as well, really based on this Gemara. The Rambam writes that there's a mitzvah of Yehavtas Hashem Elokecha, you have to love Hashem. And the Rambam says, how are you supposed to love Hashem? So the Rambam quotes this Gemara, Kichibas Zachar Nekeva, like a man loves a woman. The Rambam says, and it's so beautiful. The Rambam says, what does it mean? What happens when a man loves a woman? When a man falls in love with a woman, he cannot stop thinking about her. He's preoccupied with her. She's always on his mind. You see, the love that we strive to have with HaKadosh Baruch Hu is not a platonic love, right? It's not a love of friends. It's not a love of siblings. It's not even a love of a parent to a child. It's the love of a spouse. It's the love of marriage. It's a passionate love. It's a love in which I always just want to be with this individual. A love that I want to go ahead and constantly be physically together, right? My arms around that, and that's the love. That's the love that we are supposed to establish with the Ribono Shel Olam. And therefore the Kruvim gave physical, and the Kruvim said, look how much HaKadosh Baruch Hu loves you, and look how you're supposed to love HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Kichibas Zachar Unekeva. Incredible. Massive Rav Chisda, V'lo yabo liros kibalas HaKodesh. But this is very interesting, because we learned that you're not supposed to look at the kelim of the Beis HaMikdash, right? You're not supposed to gaze upon the Aron. After all, the Gemara says, Vam Rav Yehuda Amarav, B'shas hachnosas kelim lenartik shalahem. But listen to this, in the desert, when they would move the Mikdash, you know what would happen? The Leviim were charged with carrying the utensils. But remember, before the Leviim would come and carry, what would happen? The Kohanim would come and cover everything, because no one was permitted to gaze upon the Aron. So what's happening? All right, and again, it's next week's parsha. It's Kahas. Kahas was in charge of going ahead, and it was Naso. Kahas was in charge of going in and carrying the Aron. But first the Kohanim would come along and cover the Aron. So what are you talking about? The Kohanim would just roll, you just tell me the Kohanim would just roll back the curtain and everybody would look at the Aron. But how could that be? Shabbos is beautiful. The Gemara says this is beautiful. Rav Nachman says no. Mashal lakala can be compared to a bride. Calls manchi b'veis aviha tznuah b'mayla. So let's listen to this. A bride when she's living in her father's home. Now, what that means, what does it mean when she's living in her father's home? So we'll say, so often they would remember we do kiddushin and nisuin. We do everything together under the chuppah. But Bismana Gemara, there would often be up to a year in between kiddushin and nisuin. So they would do kiddushin, and what would happen? The girl would go back and live with her family, because you can't live with your wife until after nisuin. So they would do kiddushin, and she would go back and live with her father's home. So the Gemara says, when the Kala lives in her father's home, she's very modest from her husband, right? Which makes sense. They're not yet living together. But what happened? Listen to this Gemara. The Gemara says, Kevan Shabbos al Beis Chamea, but once she comes to her father-in-law's home, in other words, it was common for a newly married couple to live with the husband's parents. So once she marries her husband, lives with her husband, Einat Snua Mibayla. She's no longer so modest. She doesn't have to be modest from her husband. So the Gemara says something so beautiful. In the desert, we were like newlyweds with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. There was kiddushin, right? And therefore, again, the Kala was very tznuah. HaKadosh Baruch Hu was very tznuah. No one could gaze upon the Aron. But once we came to the Mikdash, that was like, again, living together in the father-in-law's home. And therefore, again, we were permitted to gaze upon the Aron. A truly beautiful idea, representing the idea that in the relationship with Hashem, there are different levels of intimate connection. There are times, ultimately, again, where we're like betrothed to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. There's like kiddushin, and then there are times of nisuin. And the nafkamina between those two times is that when there's kiddushin, there's still a little bit of distance. But when there's nisuin, there is this incredible intimacy that brings us together in a dramatic way. Maser Rav Chana Bar Katina, Ma'aser V'Kohen Echashay Misasei. But one second, we'll say, what about the story we just said before? That there was the Kohen Gadol who was one time playing with his axe. And what happened? He realized the difference in the floor. And what happened? He died, which means he wasn't permitted. Well, two stories. In the second story, they breached the floor, and the fire came out. Either way, what you're seeing over here is they weren't given permission to look upon the Aron, and yet this was in the times of the Beis Hamikdash. You're positing that when there's a Beis Hamikdash, it's like nisuin, and when it's like nisuin, you could gaze upon the Aron. But here we just saw two stories where there was a Beis Hamikdash; they were not permitted to gaze upon the Aron. To which the Gemara says something incredible. Amarlei niskarsha kamrat niskarsha chazud lechibas rishona. So we'll say here's the difference. These stories happened in the Second Temple era. What happened with the destruction of the first Beis Hamikdash? What happened? There was a divorce. There was a divorce. Second Beis Hamikdash came, there was a reconciliation. But even once there's a reconciliation in the aftermath of divorce, it's not the same. It's not the same, the Gemara says. There's still a little bit ultimately again of a distance that was there, which I will say this is representative of the second Beis Hamikdash in general. That as much as there was a reconciliation and we came back together, it was not the same as before. Which I will say, if you think about, is such an incredibly dramatic yesod in the concept of shalom bayis. Why is it so important to do whatever you can to preserve your shalom bayis? Because everyone in marriage knows that when you have a dramatic fallout, as much as you can reconcile, it's usually not the same. It's not the same. Now, sometimes it could be better because, again, sometimes it exposed relationship fault lines. But very often, even when people are able to get back together, there's baggage. There's baggage from that. And there's residual. People like to think that we can move on. You could always move on. But moving on never means forgetting. I always remember I could forgive you, but I never forget. Generally, we never forget what's happened to us. Such an incredible yesod. There was a rupture in the marriage of Klal Yisrael and HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which resulted in the divorce, the Churban Bayis Rishon. And even though we reconciled, there was Churban Bayis Sheni. There was Bayis Sheni. It wasn't the same. It wasn't the same. I will say, that's the miracle of Bayis Shlishi. Right? You know what the miracle of Bayis Shlishi is? The miracle of Bayis Shlishi is not only will there be a third Beis Hamikdash, but the relationship will be totally restored. Chadesh Yamenu Kikedem. The relationship will be restored to what it was prior to the fallout, right? Prior to the rupture, prior to the negativity. That's the miracle of Mashiach. That we rebuild the Beis Hamikdash. Well, that's not a miracle. We could rebuild the Beis Hamikdash tomorrow, or not tomorrow, Shabbos, but today, or actually wait till Sunday. But again, we can rebuild the Beis. That's not the big deal of Geula. The big deal of Geula is the restoration of the relationship to the state to the pre-traumatic state. So I'm asked, what's the case? We'll say if there was a Mikdash Rishon, if there was a Mikdash, there was no parochas. El b'Mikdash Sheni. So we're trying to go back for just a moment. The Gemara said that they would go ahead and roll back the curtain of the Kodesh HaKadosh, and the Kohanim would do that to show the people during the regalim, look how much Kadosh Baruch Hu loves you. So the Gemara says, when did that story happen? If it was the Mikdash Rishon, it can't be the Mikdash Rishon, why not? There was no curtain, there was a wall. If it was the Mikdash Sheni, mihavu kruvim, we'll say there were no kruvim during the second Beis Hamikdash. Why no kruvim? There was no aron. To which the Gemara says, the olam b'mikdash rishon. In reality, it was mikdash rishon. Umay parochas. And what's the parochas? Parochas debavi. See, I both say there were curtains. There were curtains in the mikdash rishon. All of the entrances had curtains. Amrav Zeira, Amrav Shlosha Asar Parochas Mikdash. There were 13 curtains in the mikdash rishon. Shiva Kneged Shiva Sharim. 7 corresponding to 7 entrances. Shtayim. So the Gemara says Shtayim Achas lePischo Shel Heichal VaAchas lePischo Shel Ulam. And there was one ultimately again at the entranceway of the Ulam. One of the entranceway of the Heichal to the Kodesh. Shtayim b'Dvir u'Shtayim Keneg deBaliyah. Then 2 ultimately again by the Dvir, which is the entranceway to the Kodesh HaKadoshim, and ultimately 2 in the upper stories as well. So we'll say the point over here is you're right. The Mikdash Rishon didn't have double curtains and more dramatic curtains like they had in the second Beis Hamikdash, but there were absolutely curtains by the entranceways, so they would roll back the curtains. Rav Yaakov says no. The story of the rolling back of the curtains to show the people the kruvim was during the second Beis Hamikdash. But there's no aron. So how were there kruvim? Both say it's incredible. Ukruvim ditsurasa havakaimi. Both say you're right. There were no kruvim ultimately again on the aron, but I both say there were additional kruvim. There were kruvim which were either painted on or engraved into the walls of the Kodesh HaKadoshim. This is already from the there. And those were there even during the time. They were not the kruvim of the aron, but they were images of the kruvim engraved ultimately onto the walls of the Kodesh HaKadoshim. So the Gemara says, "Dechsev ves kol kiros habayis masav kala kruvim utmaros treitsitzim betzipa zav meishal v'chulko ksiv kemaer ish ulavayos." My kemaer ish ulavayos. Amra barav shila amad beis ki ish hamu'ura b'levi shalo. That the images of the kruvim were like a man who had his arms wrapped around the one who he loves. So ultimately, again, you begin to see from here. So the Rebbe says, this is incredible. So in the kruvim of the second Beis Hamikdash were not the kruvim of the lid of the Aron. Instead, they were the kruvim ultimately of the images engraved on the walls of the Mikdash. Incredible. Amrei Shlakish, b'shasha nichnesu nachram laheichal. When the Rebbe says a very dramatic Gemara. When the Nachrim came into the Heichal, right, when the Gentile marauders came into the Beis Hamikdash, they saw the Kruvim, and they saw the Kruvim ultimately, again, with their arms wrapped around each other. Hotzion l'shok, they took them out to the marketplace. Now, so Rashi says over here, this is referring to the destruction of the second Beis Hamikdash. So which Kruvim did they take out to the marketplace? If you look at Rashi, Rashi says over Hotzion l'shok, second line in Rashi, kiplum min hakosel. They peeled them off the wall. So again, whether we're talking about engraved images or whether we're talking about, again, painted images, they took the images off the wall and they brought them out. And about say, Va'amru Yisrael halalu, shebirchasan bracha, ukilalasan klala. These Jews, whose bracha is a bracha, and whose klala is a klala. In other words, these Jews who are supposed to be so holy, yasku b'dvarim halalu. Could it be that they're engaged in this kind of stuff? In other words, I will say, they brought this out because what the Kruvim depicted an incredible sense of physical intimacy. They were embracing between a man and a woman, and so the Goyim, right, said, this is what the Jews are about. This is what they have in their holiest of places, an image depicting a man and a woman locked in a passionate embrace. This is what they have in their holiest space. What a base and immoral people. The Rebbe said, the Gemara says, miyad hizilum. And as a result, ultimately, again, Klal Yisrael was disparaged and humiliated. Shene'emar, kol mechabdea hizilu kira ervasa. Ultimately, again, literally, all those who respected him, or all the exalted ones, were degraded because they saw her nakedness. So it's actually really an incredible thing in general. What makes intimacy between a husband and a wife special is that it's private. The moment it becomes something public, this is why in general, people have to be incredibly tsanua and people have to be very incredibly private and modest about the intimate details of their married life. It's nothing to be shared with anyone else. Why? Because what makes it special is that it's something private between two people who care about each other very much. The moment that intimate relationship becomes part of the public sphere, ultimately is the moment that it becomes something base and immoral. So when the Kruvim were in the Kodesh HaKadoshim, behind the curtain, and people saw it, and again, remember they saw it, but they saw it from behind the curtain, it represented that innermost, most intimate, private love between HaKadosh Baruch Hu and Am Yisrael. But once it becomes dragged into the street, then it becomes something immoral and base. So it's incredible. The destruction, it gives you a new dimension of the Churban, that which represented the most beautiful and intimate parts of our relationship with Hashem was dragged out into the public sphere and ultimately fundamentally degraded. So, there's a whole discussion over here. There's a whole machlokes. Some understand this Gemara as referring to actually the Churban of the first Beis HaMikdash, not the second Beis HaMikdash. Rashi clearly understands it to be the second Beis HaMikdash. That's why when they speak about the Kruvim, Rashi says this is not the Kruvim on the Aron, but rather ultimately, again, this is the Kruvim on the walls that they peeled off. I will just point out that many interpret this Gemara as referring to the first Beis HaMikdash. Now, it's the first Beis HaMikdash. What's again, we don't have time for this, so I'll just say this very quick. I'll tease you with this. If it's the first Beis HaMikdash, what's interesting about this is when they took out the Aron, and I will say, this presupposes two things. Number one, that they took out the Aron during the times of the first Beis HaMikdash, and that the Kruvim were locked in an embrace at the time of the destruction. The reason why that's interesting is because the Gemara Basra says, reconciles two different psukim. There are one pasuk says the Kruvim faced towards each other. Other pasuk says the Kruvim faced away from each other. How does the Gemara reconcile that? The Gemara reconciles that when we're osin ritzono shalmakom, when we're fulfilling the will of God, the Kruvim faced each other. When we were not fulfilling the will of God, the Kruvim faced away from each other. According to this Gemara, if you understand it to mean that this is the first Beis HaMikdash, Kruvim of the Aron, it paints a picture that what? Even at the time of the destruction of Beis HaMikdash, the Kruvim were facing each other, and locked in an embrace, which I will say tells you something dramatically amazing, that even in times of Churban, and Bnei Yissaschar brings this down, even in times of Churban, and even in times of destruction, and even in times of terrible punishment, the Ribono Shel Olam's love is always there. Again, more to speak about that, but we'll put that on the list. Ushsiya Hayanikre. So let's remember again, the stone upon which the Aron was situated was called the Even Shesiya. So the Gemara says, Tana, Shemimena Hush Sasa Olam. We'll say, why is it called the Even Shesiya? Because this was the stone from which the entire world was created. Hush Sas means established. This was, apparently this stone, I will say, was the first piece of matter, right? The first stone from which everything else was created in the world. So Gemara says, Tana Kiman Dar Mitzion Nivra Olam. We'll say this reflects the opinion that says that the entire Yerushalayim was the first earth, the first earth created, and everything was created from Yerushalayim. Bisanya, Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Olam Emtziiso Nivra. Rabbi Eliezer says the world was created from its center. Shnei Amar, Batzak Esafra Lamotzak, Ragam Migad Yidobku. Rabbi Yeshua Omer, Olam Menat Stadin Nivra. Rabbi Yeshua says, no, the world was not created from its center, rather the world was created from its sides and built in. I will say there's a lot of symbolic, metaphorical meaning in all of this. We don't have time for it today, but Eretz Hashem, we will hopefully one day find the time to do it. So the Gemara says, Shnei Amar, Ki L'Shalag Yomar, Hay Arheve Aretz V'Gesh Hamata V'Gesh Hamitros Uzo. Rabbi Yitzchak Nafch Amar, Even Yorak Kadosh Baruch Hu B'Yam, Mimenu Nish Sasam. Rabbi Yitzchak says, no, the way the world was created was that Hashem took a stone and threw a stone into the sea. Remember again, when we open up Bereshis, right? What is the world? Water, right? The world is totally water. So how does the earth start? How does land start? Hashem Baruch Hu took a stone, threw it into the water, and that was the beginning of dry land. So the Gemara says, Shene Emar Alma Adonai Hetabu. O miyara even pinasa. The Chacham say mitzio nivra. But I'll say, going back for just a moment, the Chachamim say that no, the world was created from Tzion, from Yerushalayim. So we'll say Yerushalayim was the first earth that was created, and everything was built out from there. Shnei Amar Mizmar the Asaf. Ela Lokim. We'll say the Gemara quotes to the pasuk from Tehillim Nun, chapter 50. Mizmar the Asaf Ela Lokim or Kela Lokim. So a song of Asaf to Hashem. So the list is Va'omer. The next part of that pasuk says, Mitzion Michlal Yofi. Now, what does it mean, Mitzion Michlal Yofi? The way the Gemara darshans it is, Mimenu Muchlal Yof Shal Olam. From Tzion, ultimately, again, is included the beauty of the world, which means that from Tzion comes the beauty of the world. The world was created from Tzion. So ultimately, so according to this approach, the world was created from Yerushalayim, right? Yerushalayim was the first piece of earth created, but ultimately, again, the Even Shesiya was the first piece of earth created in Yerushalayim. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the Even Shesiya, from the Even Shesiya, the rest of Yerushalayim, and then from the rest of Yerushalayim comes the rest of the earth. So Tanya Belezer Gadol Omer, Eile Toldos Hashem va'aretz bihi baram, b'yoma sos Hashem Elokim Eretz Hashemayim. So ultimately, again, Rabbi Eliezer Gadol says, the pasuk says, these are the Toldos, right? Literally, this is the offspring of the Shemayim and the Aretz, the heavens and the earth. Bihi baram, when He created them, on the day that Hashem created the heavens and the earth. Toldos Shemayim Shemayim Nivru, Toldos Aretz Me'aretz Nivru. And Rabbi Eliezer holds that which exists in the heavens was made from the heavens, and that which exists on the earth was made from the earth. The Chacham say no. Elu v'elu mitzion nivru. Both is actually quite beautiful. The Rabbi Chacham say everything came from Tzion, which I will say, what Rabbi Eliezer seems to be saying is even that which exists in the heavens ultimately comes from Tzion. Anything material in this world comes from Yerushalayim. Shnei Amar Mizmar the Asaf Kel Elokim Hashem Diber Vayikra Eretz Mimizrach Shemesh Ad Muva'ova Omer Mitzion Michlal Yofi Elokim Hofia Mimenu Muchlal Yof Shal Olam. We'll say it's that last phrase, really, Mimenu Muchlal Yof Shal Olam, that ultimately, again, Mitzia Michlal Yofi, that phrase, which is the words of David HaMelech, teaches us from Tzion, Muchlal Yof Shal Olam. Ultimately, again, from Tzion, the rest of the beauty of the world emanated. All the beauty in this world comes from Tzion. So we'll say, interestingly enough, a multiple way machlokes about the genesis of the world. Did the world start from the center? Did the world start from the sides? Did the world start ultimately again from a stone being cast into the sea? And again, I just want to point out, I'll say, this is not just simply an academic machlokes about how the world was created. This embedded in this machlokes is fundamental machlokes about the very nature of creation, the very tachlis habriya. But the Mishnah reflects this idea that the world was created from the Even Shasiya, what we call the foundation stone, the stone from which the entire creation began, the Even Misham Hushsas Ha'olam, and ultimately, again, that stone creates the rest of Yerushalayim, and Kimitzion, not just Teitzei Torah, the Kimitzion Teitzei Olam. The world itself comes from Yerushalayim, the world itself comes from Sion, which means, I will say, Rabbi Nachman, at the end of this, Rabbi Nachman says, you see from here, that since the world was created from Sion, there is a little bit of Kedushas Eretz Yisrael embedded in the entire world. That's why anywhere you go in this world, you have the ability to access Nitzutzei Kedosha, the ability to go and access sparks of holiness. Why is that? Why is every single part of the world ultimately have Kedusha? Because in some way, somehow, some form, every part of the world traces its origin back to Zion, back to Yerushalayim.
All of a sudden came up on my screen. I thought they would push something.
Yeah.